In a room deep underground, where no sunlight could reach, a group of people gathered. They called themselves the Council of Shadows, a secret organization that had existed for centuries. Their purpose was to harness supernatural powers to gain knowledge beyond that of ordinary humans. But this time, their ambition knew no bounds. They wanted to summon Lucifer, the one believed to know all about the future of humanity. The central room was covered in ancient inscriptions carved into the walls, eerie symbols glowing faintly as candlelight flickered. A magical circle drawn in blood lay in the center of the room, with mysterious writings twisting like living creatures. The leader of the council, a middle-aged man named Magnus, stepped to the center. In his hand was an ancient book, its leather cover worn and cracked, rumored to contain the most powerful summoning ritual ever recorded. "Tonight," Magnus declared in a deep voice, "we will confront Lucifer. We will learn the future of humanity and seize control of it." Whispers from the members echoed, interlaced with anxiety and excitement. None of them were entirely certain of what they were about to do, but greed and the lust for knowledge had blinded all fear. Magnus began reciting incantations from the book, each word tearing through the space. A cold wind suddenly blew through the room. Although there were no windows or exits, the candles flared intensely, then abruptly went out, leaving the room in utter darkness. Then a bright red light slowly emerged from the magical circle. From it, a tall figure appeared, tattered, black wings spread wide as if to encompass the entire room. His eyes glowed, burning like two hellish abysses. The air grew suffocating, each breath filled with extreme dread. Lucifer had arrived. "You have called me," Lucifer said, his voice deep and echoing like thousands of voices from the abyss. "What makes you risk your souls to summon me?" Magnus, suppressing his fear, stepped forward. "We want to know the future of humanity," he said, his voice trembling. "We want to know how to survive and hold supreme power in this collapsing world." Lucifer laughed, a chilling sound that made everyone in the room feel as though their hearts were being squeezed. The future of humanity? He stepped closer, each step making the ground shake. "Do you think the knowledge of the future is something you can bear? Let me show you." Lucifer raised his hand, and a whirlwind of darkness engulfed the room. All members of the council were sucked into a collective nightmare. They saw images of burning cities, people screaming in agony as darkness consumed them. Horrifying monsters emerged from nothingness, destroying everything in their path. Magnus screamed, "Stop! We don't want to see any more!" But Lucifer only laughed. "This is the future you wish to control, but instead of the truth, I grant you a gift, the curse. From now on, every night you will see these visions replaying in your minds. There is no escape, no place to hide." The darkness receded, leaving the room in ruins. The council members lay scattered on the floor, their eyes wide open, filled with fear and madness. Magnus screamed, realizing that the knowledge they craved had turned into a curse, destroying their very minds. Lucifer vanished, leaving behind a final message echoing in the room. "Knowledge is not for the greedy, and you will forever be prisoners of your own desires." Magnus collapsed to the floor, his trembling hands clutching the magical book, now empty. The inscriptions that once adorned its pages were now mere black smudges, as if the presence of Lucifer had stolen its soul. The other council members lay motionless around, their eyes frozen wide with the horrors they had witnessed. None of them were the same. The nightmares had rooted deep in their minds, pulling them into a hazy state between reality and illusion. Magnus, though still conscious, felt the darkness gnawing at his soul. Bit by bit, suddenly, one of the members began to move, It was Ilara, the youngest woman in the council, her eyes now blazing red, void of life. She stood up, her steps heavy, as if controlled by an unseen force. She looked at Magnus, then spoke, but it wasn't her voice, rather a deep, haunting sound. "You have opened the door, Magnus, and now you have not only received the curse, but become part of the darkness you so desired." Magnus backed away, horrified. "No, Ilara, don't let it control you." But Ilara did not respond. She stepped into the magic circle, where Lucifer's darkness still lingered, like a mirror reflecting the chaos within her mind. The symbols on the floor began to glow again, but this time they did not obey human summoning. A chilling wind rose, and Magnus knew one thing for certain. The darkness was coming back, stronger than ever, to claim not only their souls, but also the outside world. The other members stood up one by one, like puppets without strings, their eyes empty yet full of power. They began chanting incantations that didn't belong to the book, words that made the air so heavy that Magnus felt like he was being crushed. Magnus knew he didn't have much time. He searched the book, hoping to find some way to stop the ongoing ritual, but all he found was darkness creeping everywhere. "We have to stop. If we don't, we will destroy everything," he shouted. Ilara turned to look at him, her eyes glowing, and for the first time, she gave a cold, emotionless smile. "Magnus, don't you understand? This is the end, and also a new beginning. We are no longer just humans. We have become servants of the eternal darkness." And then the room exploded. The stone walls cracked, darkness engulfing everything in sight. Magnus could only scream one last time before feeling his body being consumed. However, amidst the chaotic swirl, a faint light flickered from somewhere in Magnus's mind. It was an image of a life before ambition blinded him. He realized that hope wasn't completely extinguished. As the darkness enveloped everything, Magnus felt a strange change. There were no more screams, no more resistance. Everything was silent, heavy, as if all life had been wiped out. But in that silence, Magnus heard a small, faint sound, like a whisper of a drop of water falling into the abyss. The whisper grew louder, becoming a rhythmic sequence, echoing like his soul's whisper. It wasn't the voice of darkness, but music, a familiar melody, filled with pain and regret. Magnus recognized it as a piece he had composed when he was a young musician, before being swallowed by ambition and power. That melody was like a thin thread, pulling Magnus back from the brink of despair. Despite being surrounded by darkness, he followed the sound, each step feeling like wading through thick, heavy black water. Ilara and the other council members stood there, motionless, their glowing red eyes following Magnus. But they didn't move, as if bound by the very darkness they had summoned. As Magnus reached the center of the room, where the ritual had started, he saw a small, bright object glinting amid the ritual's ruins. It was a shard of broken mirror, forgotten amidst the aftermath. In it, Magnus saw his reflection, not as an old man tormented by ambition, but a younger, more innocent version of himself before everything collapsed. "You still have a choice," a familiar voice echoed from the shard. It was Magnus's voice, filled with clarity and hope. "Break this cycle before it's too late." Magnus picked up the shard. The light from it spread throughout the room, pushing the darkness back a little. The etched symbols on the floor began to quiver, as if influenced by a greater power. But at that moment, a deep laugh echoed from the darkness. Lucifer appeared once again, this time not as a faint figure, but as a clear entity with blazing eyes and a mocking smile. "Do you think a little light can destroy me, Magnus? You summoned me, signed a pact with the darkness. There is no escape." Magnus looked at Lucifer, his eyes full of determination. "I made a mistake, but I won't let that mistake determine everyone's fate." He raised the shard of the mirror high, and the light from it became blinding, like a fire blazing in the dark. Lucifer roared. The darkness around him twisted, as if being scorched. The other council members started to scream, their glowing red eyes dimming, replaced with expressions of pain and regret. The light from the shard gradually filled the entire room, banishing the darkness and returning everything to its original state. The eerie symbols on the floor vanished, and Lucifer, along with his darkness, was pushed back into the void, leaving behind an eerie silence. Magnus collapsed, the shard breaking in his hand. The room now empty, only the council members lay motionless on the floor, but their breaths had returned. They were alive, bearing the scars of darkness. Magnus looked around, realizing the ritual had been broken, but the price was too high, his soul now fractured, and he knew he would never be fully forgiven. In the corner of the room, Ilara awakened, her eyes clear once more. She looked at Magnus, her voice weak but full of gratitude. "You saved us, but you have to live with that." Magnus nodded, saying nothing. He knew that darkness never truly disappears, but light, however small, always has the power to conquer it. With heavy steps, he left the room, carrying the burden of his mistakes and the lessons he would never forget. Ilara slowly stood up, her eyes following Magnus as he walked towards the door. But instead of letting him go, she spoke, her voice weak but resonant. "No one can bear all the mistakes alone, Magnus. You broke the curse, but the darkness still lingers within us. We have to face it together." Magnus stopped, his back still turned to her. He felt the truth in her words, but the guilt and weariness made him afraid to turn back. "I've gone too far," he said, his voice deep and heavy. "This light is not for me. It's for those who still have a chance, like you." Ilara stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. That gentle touch, though small, made Magnus feel as if all the pain he had endured was suddenly shared. "No one is born to remain in darkness," she said. "Not even you, Magnus. If you truly believe light can overcome darkness, then believe you deserve it too." Her words echoed in Magnus's mind, stirring a feeling he had long forgotten. Hope. He turned to face Ilara. In her eyes, he saw no blame or fear, only determination. She was no longer a part of the darkness, but the proof that it can be defeated. Magnus nodded slowly, not out of resignation, but acceptance. "If so, we will together illuminate what the darkness has obscured, not just for ourselves, but for others too." Ilara gave a gentle smile, and they left the room together. Outside, the gloomy sky of the city was gradually shifting to a different tone. Dawn's light appeared on the horizon, illuminating the old buildings once engulfed by darkness. The people on the streets, though still fearful, began to feel a sense of relief in the air, as if an invisible veil had been lifted from their lives. Magnus and Ilara walked down the cobblestone path without saying a word to each other, the traces of darkness still etched deep within their souls. But now they no longer faced it alone. In the distance, the church bells rang, a reminder that no matter how great the darkness, there is always a light waiting, guide the way. Magnus and Ilara continued walking in silence, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones like the somber rhythm of time. Each step seemed to carry the burdens they had endured. "Magnus," Ilara broke the silence, "what do you think about what just happened? About everything we've done?" Magnus paused, looking into the distance. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that darkness never truly disappears. It's always lurking, ready to rise when we are careless. But light is the same. It is not as weak as we once thought. It is the choice that determines where we belong. Ilara remained silent, but a spark of understanding flashed in her eyes. "Then we must be prepared," she said firmly, "not just to protect ourselves, but to prevent the darkness from consuming others. We cannot let it spread any further." Magnus nodded. "Right. But we cannot do this alone. Maybe it's time to seek out others, those who also see the dangers of the darkness and are willing to fight with us." That idea kindled a spark of hope in both. Magnus and Ilara, survivors of the hellish darkness, now carried a greater mission: to warn and prepare for a battle they knew would not be easy. As they neared the edge of the city, a figure appeared from afar, walking towards them. It was a man in a long cloak, with a face deeply marked by time and suffering. But in his eyes, like Magnus and Ilara, there remained the light of life and hope. He turned to face Ilara. In her eyes he saw no blame or fear, only determination. She was no longer a part of the darkness, but proof that it can be defeated. Magnus nodded slowly, not out of resignation, but acceptance. "If so, we will together illuminate what the darkness has obscured, not just for ourselves, but for others too." Ilara gave a gentle smile, and they left the room together. Outside, the gloomy sky of the city was gradually shifting to a different tone. Dawn's light appeared on the horizon, illuminating the old buildings once engulfed by darkness. The people on the streets, though still fearful, began to feel a sense of relief in the air, as if an invisible veil had been lifted from their lives. Magnus and Ilara walked down the cobblestone path without saying a word to each other. The traces of darkness still etched deep within their souls. Now they no longer faced it alone. In the distance, the church bells rang, a reminder that no matter how great the darkness, there is always a light waiting to guide the way. Magnus and Ilara continued walking in silence, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones like the somber rhythm of time. Each step seemed to carry the burdens they had endured. "Magnus," Ilara broke the silence, "what do you think about what just happened? About everything we've done?" Magnus paused, looking into the distance. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that darkness never truly disappears. It's always lurking, ready to rise when we are careless, but light is the same. It is not as weak as we once thought. It is the choice that determines where we belong." Ilara remained silent, but a spark of understanding flashed in her eyes. "Then we must be prepared," she said firmly. "Not just to protect ourselves, but to prevent the darkness from consuming others. We cannot let it spread any further." Magnus nodded. "Right, but we cannot do this alone. Maybe it's time to seek out others, those who also see the dangers of the darkness and are willing to fight with us." That idea kindled a spark of hope in both. Magnus and Ilara, survivors of the hellish darkness, now carried a greater mission: to warn and prepare for a battle they knew would not be easy. As they neared the edge of the city, a figure appeared from afar, walking towards them. It was a man in a long cloak, with a face deeply marked by time and suffering. But in his eyes, like Magnus and Ilara, there remained the light of life and hope. The man stopped as he faced them, looking deep into their eyes, as if reading the story they carried. "You have seen the darkness," he said in a deep, powerful voice. "And yet you stand here with light in your hearts. I know what you seek, and I walk the same path." The man in the cloak looked at Magnus and Ilara, his eyes flashing with determination. "My name is Alaric," he said, his voice like an undercurrent, "and I have faced the darkness just like you. But I did not merely survive. I learned to master it." Magnus frowned. "Master the darkness? How is that possible?" Alaric smirked. a smile half proud, half wistful. Darkness is not just an enemy, but a part of each of us. Only by facing it, understanding it, can we use it as a strength rather than be consumed by it. Ilara stepped forward, her gaze serious. If what you say is true, then why are you here? Why didn't you stop the Council of Shadows before things went so wrong? Alaric took a deep breath, his shoulders heavy as if bearing the weight of the world. I tried. But the darkness in each heart is something no one can force them to forsake. The Council chose wrong, and the price they paid is a lesson this world must remember forever. Magnus furrowed his brow, considering Alaric's words. So what do you want from us now? Alaric turned and pointed toward a misty path leading deep into the dark forest. I want nothing, but if you truly wish to fight against the darkness, if you want to stop it from spreading, then this is the path you need to take. Ilara looked up at the path before them, a cold chill emanating from the dense foliage. What is it? Another trap of the darkness? Alaric shook his head, his gaze serious. Not a trap, but a trial. In this forest you will face the darkness within you. If you overcome it, you will find a light stronger than ever. But if you fail... He didn't need to say more. The cost was clear. Magnus and Ilara exchanged a glance. Both knew there was no turning back. They had ventured too far into the darkness to retreat, and the light they sought could only be achieved by facing their greatest fears. We will go, Magnus said firmly. Lead the way, Alaric. Alaric smiled, not a smile of relief, but one of someone aware of the challenges ahead. I cannot lead you. This path must be walked by each person alone, but I will wait for you on the other side if you make it through. With those words, Alaric stepped back, disappearing into the thick darkness, leaving Magnus and Ilara standing at the brink of their destined trial. Magnus stood at the forest's edge, feeling as if the entire universe was silently watching. Ilara took a step back, but her eyes still glowed with determination. Magnus, she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. We need a plan. This darkness is unlike anything we've ever faced. It is alive, and it is watching us. Magnus nodded, his hand gripping the hilt of the sword he always carried. Not a plan, Ilara. We need clarity. This darkness is not just out there, it's within us. Together they took a step toward the forest's edge, and as soon as their feet touched the dry leaves, the world around them transformed. It felt like the earth melted away, the light drained, leaving only an abyss of the deepest night. Ilara suddenly felt a cold breath brush her neck. She whipped around but only saw Magnus still standing beside her. Did you see that? She whispered, her voice echoing from many directions. Magnus didn't answer. He was staring at a figure ahead, a child with tangled hair and sunken eyes looking straight at him. The child laughed, the sound echoing, then pointed at him. Magnus, it called, its voice like a howling wind. Do you remember me? You abandoned me. You let me die. Magnus froze. He recognized that face, the face of his younger brother whom he couldn't save many years ago. Ilara wasn't spared from the psychological torment either. A familiar voice whispered behind her, gentle yet haunting. Ilara, it's your mother. Why did you leave me alone? She turned, and the figure of a woman appeared, gaunt, with deep, tear-filled eyes. Ilara choked up, her legs feeling like they were frozen in place. No, Mother isn't here. This isn't real. The ghostly images continued to surround them, the darkness trying to break their spirits. Magnus gripped his sword tightly, regaining his composure. He looked straight at the ghost of his brother, his eyes resolute. You are not my brother. My brother passed away in peace, and I won't let the darkness use that memory against me. He swung his sword, and the ghost dissipated like smoke. Ilara watched Magnus, took a deep breath, and faced the ghost of her mother. She clutched the locket in her hand, the only thing left of her deceased mother. "Mother, I love you, but I know this isn't you. I won't let the darkness control me." The woman faded, then vanished with a sigh. Magnus and Ilara stood still, the space around them sinking into a deadly silence. There was no guiding light, no more ghostly figures, only an endless black void and the feeling that the whole world was watching them from afar. "What now?" Ilara whispered, her voice tense. Magnus didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes, trying to listen for anything that could help them move forward. And then he realized. It wasn't his ears, but his heart that was the key. "Close your eyes, Ilara," he said seriously. Ilara hesitated but complied. They both stood still, listening to the sound of their own souls. A cold breeze swept through, carrying a distant whisper. "You wish to continue?" "Then prove your courage." The ground beneath them began to tremble. From the darkness, a massive door appeared, etched with strange symbols and grotesque figures. On the door was an inscription in blood. "Only those willing to face the truth may pass." Ilara swallowed hard. What truth? Magnus looked at the door, feeling as if it was judging him. Perhaps the truth about ourselves. The door emitted a screech, then slowly opened. Inside was neither light nor darkness, but vivid images from their past. Ilara stepped in, and immediately she found herself standing in a field of blood. Soldiers lay fallen everywhere, and in the middle was her. Holding a blood-stained sword, her eyes cold like a murderer. "No!" Ilara screamed, stepping back. But the image clung to her, every word of accusation echoing in her mind. Magnus was also drawn into his memories. He stood in a burning village, smoke choking the air. Children cried, the elderly lay collapsed on the ground. And he, with blood-stained hands, stood there like a ruthless enemy. "I didn't do this!" Magnus shouted, but his voice only echoed back like a taunt. The door wouldn't let them escape. It forced them to face all the sins they had tried to bury, the memories they never wanted to recall. Ilara knelt down, tears streaming down her face. "How are we supposed to get through this?" Magnus clenched his fists, staring directly at his own image. "We can't run, Ilara. We can only face it." He stepped forward, confronting his own reflection. "I don't deny what I've done, but I won't let it define me. I accept this guilt, but I won't let it control me anymore." The image before him vanished, like smoke carried away by the wind. Ilara saw this and did the same. "I can't undo the mistakes of the past, but I can live to atone for them. I'm not afraid of the truth anymore." The terrifying memories faded, leaving them with an empty space. The door behind them closed, and before them appeared another path, a path made of shimmering lights like jewels. Magnus turned to Ilara, his gaze filled with determination. "We have overcome the darkness within. Now only the road ahead remains." Ilara nodded, walking beside him. But both knew that each step on this path would bring even fiercer trials. Entering the new path, Magnus and Ilara no longer felt the peace of light or the engulfing darkness. Only an endless space remained, with no sign of time or place. Everything around them was still, so still that every breath became deafening. As they continued, the atmosphere grew heavier. A sense of unease enveloped them, and both felt the presence of an invisible force watching their every move. "We're not just facing the ghosts of the past," Ilara whispered, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It feels like something is waiting for us." Magnus didn't respond, but he felt it too. A distant sound like footsteps unseen echoed through the space. It wasn't the sound of human footsteps, but something much more eerie. Suddenly the light from the jewel-like beams on the path began to fade, and the darkness from the deep recesses of the path's edges began to spread. Shadows slithered around them, creeping across the ground like creatures beyond control, just waiting for the right moment to engulf them in despair. "We can't let it swallow us," Magnus said, his voice firm, though his worry was evident. "We must keep moving forward." Ilara nodded, but in her eyes was a piercing gaze, as if she was trying to see what couldn't be seen. The shadows began to form strange shapes, resembling the ghosts from the depths of nightmares, images they had long forgotten. Suddenly, from the darkness, a laugh echoed, not from the living, but from something dark and incomprehensible. The entire space seemed to tremble, and everything around them blurred, as though this hellish place was just a hollow void. "Don't think you can escape," a voice from the darkness called out, deep and cold, as if it echoed from the very depths of hell. "All who walk this path are prey to the nightmares we create." Magnus and Ilara stopped, feeling as though something was staring at them. The ghosts were not only images of the past, but also the monsters within their own souls, the fears they had once faced. The souls trapped in the darkness were now free to emerge, showing their forms and wills. "We are not afraid," Ilara said, each word spoken strongly, but she could not hide the fear in her heart. "We have faced the darkness before, we can overcome it again." With renewed determination, they continued forward, despite the darkness growing ever thicker. But with each step they took, the ghosts around them became more violent. Whispered voices of unease, like curses, began to ring in their ears, pushing them into challenges they had never anticipated. Both of them knew that in this space, where time had no meaning, they would have to fight against themselves, against the worst things they had ever experienced, and against the images they could not forget. The road ahead was still long, and no one knew where it would lead them, but one thing was certain. If they did not overcome this challenge, nothing would remain but the eternity of darkness. Magnus and Ilara continued forward, surrounded by nothing but darkness. With every step, they felt the weight of the dark waves as if they were being pulled down, wanting to drown them in an endless ocean. The air became more suffocating, their breaths cut off by the all-encompassing gloom. Suddenly before them appeared a pitch-black cliff, seemingly endless. A small door, just big enough for one person to pass through, appeared in the middle of the cliff. The light from the jewel-like stones had begun to fade, giving way to the thick darkness. Ilara stopped, sensing the presence of something on the other side of the door. "There's something there," she said, her voice trembling, but still trying to remain calm. Magnus stepped closer to the door, his hand reaching out for it. As his hand touched the surface of the door, a cold surge of energy rushed into his body, making him shiver. "This is not a normal path," Magnus whispered, his eyes narrowing in caution. Suddenly, from within the door, a voice echoed, the voice of a creature that was not human, but a dark entity. "You think you can pass through me? You have no idea what awaits you. Those who enter this hell cannot return." Ilara shot a look at Magnus, as if asking whether they should continue, but in Magnus's eyes she saw unwavering resolve. He knew they had no choice but to press on through the door. "We have to go," Magnus said, his voice resolute. He reached out and grabbed the door, pushing it open. A screeching noise like steel scraping through the air rang out as the door opened, revealing a vast pitch-black space. Stepping in, they felt the coldness envelop them, as if the air had been sucked out. The door slammed shut behind them, and they realized there was no turning back. They had been pulled into a hell with no escape, no light, and the ghosts of the past continued to chase every step they took. Before them lay a long road leading through strange sights that were not of this world. The ghosts hovered around them, strange creatures whose eyes glowed like cold flames. The atmosphere here was dense, as though they had wandered into a space outside of the world, a place where no life existed, only the endless darkness. "We have to keep going," Ilara said, though every word she spoke was filled with unease. "We can't stay here forever." Magnus nodded. He knew no matter what, they had to find a way to face this darkness. But the deeper they went, the more they felt the presence of something, a hostile entity, waiting for them. "We can endure," Magnus said, his voice filled with determination, though deep inside he was uncertain whether they could overcome these trials. As they stepped inside, the darkness grew thicker to the point where nothing could be seen except the faint streaks of light from their feeble torches. Suddenly, from ahead, a laugh echoed, filled with contempt and malice. The sound was like a blade, slicing through the silence, making both Magnus and Ilara startle. A figure appeared in the darkness. It was no ordinary person. The tall shadow, surrounded by a black aura, slowly moved closer. As it drew nearer, a grotesque face gradually emerged, with eyes glowing bright, red like fire, and a brutal visage resembling a monster. "Welcome to my hell," a deep, strange voice echoed. "I am Abaddon, the son of Satan. You have found the path here, but this is where your journey ends." Ilara furrowed her brow, a wave of terror rising in her heart, but she did not dare to retreat. She turned to Magnus, and in his gaze she saw determination. "We must fight," Abaddon laughed, but there was no joy in his laugh. "You don't understand. No one can oppose me. I am eternal darkness." With a gentle motion, Abaddon raised his hand, and immediately the darkness around them seemed to come alive, stretching out to grab both of them. Magnus felt searing pain invade his body as though the dark waves were draining his life force. Ilara screamed, regaining her composure, and charged forward, swinging the gleaming silver sword she had brought with her. But Abaddon's darkness was too powerful. Her sword could only cut through a small part of it, as if battling an invisible force that couldn't be defeated. "Don't waste your strength," Abaddon said, his eyes burning brightly. "You won't escape." Magnus stood firm, a faint light emanating from his body. He knew he didn't have much strength left, but he couldn't give up. "We will not surrender." Abaddon lowered his hand, and suddenly the dark ghosts around them reached out, like invisible arms tightening around their bodies. Both Magnus and Ilara felt the pain and destruction overwhelming their entire consciousness. "You think you can defeat me?" Abaddon challenged, his lips curling into a smile, and the last light in Magnus's eyes began to fade. Ilara struggled to resist, but her body grew weaker as the dark spirits gnawed at her mind and body. The wounds would not heal, and she felt the life force draining from her. "Oh, it can't end like this," she whispered, but her words were swallowed by the endless dark space, unheard by anyone. Abaddon moved closer, his hand touching her forehead, and the last light from Ilara's eyes faded into the infinite darkness. No cry for help, no trace left. Ilara was gone. Magnus, now standing alone in the darkness, collapsed. "No, we lost," he gasped, blood seeping from his wounds, but he still smiled. A weak, desperate smile. Abaddon looked at Magnus, his eyes gleaming as if the end had been destined. "You think you can stop me? No one can." With a simple wave of his hand, the darkness completely engulfed Magnus. Dark energies wrapped around him, crushing his body and shattering his soul in excruciating pain. No one remained standing, no trace, no hope, only the shadow of Abaddon transforming into Alaric, sneering with contempt. "Just two fools like you trying to conquer hell?" idiots!" Abaddon and Alaric bowed in reverence. "We salute you, Lord Lucifer,"